The air over Wagadugu was heavy that night, not with rain, but with the kind of thick, electric tension that whispers of betrayal. Dust rolled through the narrow alleys like silent ghosts. Somewhere in the labyrinth of the capital, behind crumbling walls and flickering street lamps, dangerous plans were being made. Plans that could change the fate of a nation forever. Few knew it then, but darkness was gathering against a man who had dared to challenge centuries of silent chains. His name was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a name that had, in a matter of months, come to symbolize hope, defiance, and a new vision for Burkina Faso. A man who had risen not from polished corridors or foreign classrooms, but from the very soil he vowed to protect. Traoré stood where few dared stand, confronting foreign powers that had for generations treated his homeland like a chessboard. France, the United States. Their reach was long, their grip suffocating, but Traoré had refused to kneel. And, for that, enemies gathered like vultures circling overhead. In hidden corners of the city, a different kind of meeting took place. A secret group of soldiers, once sworn to defend their homeland, now whispered of overthrow. Some called him reckless, too bold, too dangerous. But their real fear was clear. Traoré's courage threatened the old arrangements, the ones that kept pockets lined with foreign gold and influence flowing unseen. Sources would later reveal that these men were not acting alone. Hidden hands, connected to distant embassies and shadowy operatives, were pulling the strings. They made promises. Riches, swift promotions, safe havens should they succeed. They didn't have to be told what to do, they already knew. When Captain Traoré next traveled north to rally his commanders, they would strike. They would blame it on terrorists. They would seize power in the chaos. To the outside world, it would look like a tragic accident, a young leader caught in the crossfire. Neatly explained, quickly forgotten. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that Traoré was already ahead of them. Long before their first whispered meetings, he had sensed the tremors beneath the ground. Long before the first bribe changed hands, he had built something invisible. A new intelligence force, loyal not to power or wealth, but to the soul of Burkina Faso itself. In markets, in military barracks, in dimly lit cafes, his agents listened. They followed trails of foreign cash. They mapped secret gatherings. They waited. And they were very, very patient. The soldiers, sharpening their knives in the dark, believed they were unseen. They thought their codes, their meeting points, their whispered promises were safe. But every step they took tightened the net around them. Every plan they made was one step closer to their own downfall. Captain Traoré did not move swiftly. He let the betrayal grow fat and careless. He let them believe they were invincible. Because he knew, when the trap finally snapped shut, it wouldn't just be about stopping a coup. It would be about revealing something much bigger. Something that stretched far beyond the barracks of Wagadugu. As the city slept uneasily in night, the stage was already set. The knives were drawn. The betrayal was complete. And in the silence before the first strike, Ibrahim Traoré waited in the shadows, calm, watching, ready to deliver a blow that would echo not just across Burkina Faso, but across all of Africa. The storm was coming, and no one would be left untouched. In the suffocating darkness of Wagadugu's military barracks, the conspirators gathered for what they believed would be their final night in the shadows. Their faces were rigid with fear and ambition, illuminated only by the dim glow of a single hanging bulb. The air was thick with sweat and whispered oaths, promises of power exchanged in low, trembling voices. They had made their decision. They would move tonight. They believed the future of Burkina Faso could be seized in a few brutal minutes. One gunshot, one staged tragedy, and a new order would rise. Their hearts pounded, fueled not by loyalty to their homeland, but by the glint of foreign gold and the irresistible promise of fast promotions. Their plan had been crafted with chilling precision. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man who had dared to tell the West no, the man who had expelled foreign troops and seized back national resources, was scheduled to travel north the next morning. There, in the dust and open roads of Burkina Faso's remote regions, they would strike. The ambush would be blamed on terrorist groups, a story easily swallowed by the international media. Panic would erupt. Leadership would collapse. In the confusion, the conspirators would declare emergency control. Foreign interests would quietly step back in, cloaked behind new faces, new flags, and the old games of influence and theft. It was a coup crafted not only with weapons, but with the heavy, invisible hands of foreign powers, who believed Africa was still theirs to shape. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't even begin to imagine, was that the trap had already been set. Long before their first late-night meeting, Captain Traoré had been watching. He had learned from history's brutal lessons. Coups never announce themselves loudly. They whisper first, like the soft scratching of rats inside palace. Walls. And so he had built a new kind of defense, not of steel, but of loyalty. A silent army of patriots hidden in plain sight. Men and women who cared nothing for bribes, who answered to no foreign flag. Among the very traitors plotting the assassination, Ibrahim's eyes and ears were already present. One of their own, or so they believed, had been quietly recording every plan, memorizing every password, tracing every meeting point. Messages were intercepted. Bribes were tracked. Weapon caches were mapped. Night after night, while the plotters whispered in secret, the information flowed directly to Traoré's command center. And Traoré waited, not in fear, but with patience, letting the betrayal ripen, letting the traitors walk deeper into their own graves. That final night, the tension inside the barracks was suffocating. Uniforms were pressed, rifles were cleaned and loaded. Escape routes were reviewed. They moved like phantoms, convinced they were operating under an impenetrable cloak of secrecy. Each man thought he was about to become a kingmaker, a hero of the new regime. They carried foreign radios tuned to secret channels. They clutched encrypted devices with coded instructions from contacts far away, some messages written in the sterile, detached language of Western intelligence operatives. Asset must be neutralized before Q4. Priority, northern route secured. Funds approved for secondary team, avoid exposure at all costs. To the soldiers, these were lifelines. Proof they were protected, promised, rewarded. But even as they clicked their weapons into place, another force was already moving. Across Wagadugu, checkpoints slammed shut without warning. Roads leading to and from the barracks were silently sealed. In the heart of the capital, elite units, men fiercely loyal to Traoré, readied their sweep. Their orders were clear. Move fast, strike hard, leave no gaps. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a message. As the conspirators finalized their betrayal, they heard the first boots pounding the ground outside. Confused shouts echoed through the corridors. Then the doors burst open. In a flash of violence, they were overwhelmed. No! Shots fired. No grand standoff, just the cold, clinical efficiency of a leader who had refused to let chaos win. One by one, the traitors were dragged from their hiding places. Bags filled with crisp US dollars and fresh euros were found tucked beneath beds. Foreign-made radios, still whispering static-coded orders, were seized. Phones with encrypted apps and numbers traced back to embassy-linked contacts were confiscated. One soldier tried to destroy his phone, but it was too late. The intelligence had already been extracted. Another was caught with a French-made radio, device set to a covert channel known to be used by private security firms operating under diplomatic covers. When interrogated, most of the conspirators held firm, lips tight with fear, but not all. In a moment of broken desperation, one soldier cracked. His voice, barely above a whisper, confessed the unthinkable. They promised us safety. They promised we'd be protected if it failed, but it didn't just fail, it collapsed. At that moment, the true scope of the betrayal, the true cowardice of it, was laid bare. These men hadn't fought for a cause, or for justice, or even for personal glory. They had sold themselves, cheaply, to faceless foreign masters who viewed Burkina Faso not as a nation, but as a piece of property. The conspirators weren't revolutionaries, they were mercenaries without honor, willing to destroy their homeland for a brief flash of foreign approval. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not rush, to address the public. He let the silence speak for itself. In the hours after the arrests, no official statement was made. Across Wagadugu, rumors ignited like brushfires. Crowds gathered outside government buildings. People whispered of midnight arrests, of soldiers caught in the act of betrayal. Tension crackled through the streets. What had happened? Was the president alive? Was the government safe? But Traoré remained silent, gathering the pieces of a shattered conspiracy with quiet fury. The coup had not just failed. It had been dismantled with surgical precision, exposed for what it was, a foreign-backed betrayal masquerading as rebellion. And soon the world would see it too. The conspirators thought they had the element of surprise. They thought they held secret weapons, secret plans, secret allies. But in the end, they were outmatched by something far more powerful. The loyalty of a people who had decided they would never kneel again. The night that was meant to mark the death of a revolution instead became the night it was reborn. The traitors hadn't merely failed, they had collapsed, completely, utterly, and publicly, and the reckoning had only just begun. Morning broke over Wagadugu, but it was not the morning the conspirators had imagined. Instead of triumphant announcements or staged broadcasts claiming a national emergency, the city woke to an eerie, buzzing tension. The streets pulsed with restless crowds. Rumors moved faster than the dust swirling in the rising heat. Something had happened overnight, something big. No one knew the full story yet, but everyone could feel it. The earth had shifted. By midday, the capital stood still, holding its breath. Then came the sound that would ignite the streets into a frenzy, the low rumble of military trucks grinding toward the city center. People poured from their homes and market stalls, drawn to the commotion by something primal, something electric, in the air. What they saw next would be burned into Burkina Faso's memory forever. Row after row of captured soldiers were marched into the public square, their hands bound tightly in chains, their faces uncovered, exposed for all to see. There were no masks to hide their shame. No dignified uniforms to shield them, just the brutal, naked truth of betrayal. Men who had once worn medals on their chests, who had once laughed proudly in cafes and commanded troops with arrogance, now knelt in the blazing sun, heads bowed low to the dirt, surrounded by armed guards. At the front of this grim procession stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, not hidden behind glass, not sheltered by distance. He was there, real and tangible, a man forged by fire, standing with the full weight of a betrayed nation on his shoulders. The national flag snapped sharply in the hot wind behind him, a vivid splash of defiance against the dust-filled sky. There were no notes in his hands, no carefully scripted speech from advisors. When Traoré spoke, his voice carried the raw, cutting force of truth stripped to its core. He did not yell. He didn't need to. His calmness was more terrifying than any shout. "These men," he said, gesturing toward the traitors kneeling before him, "are not patriots. They are not heroes. They are traitors." A ripple of shock swept through the crowd. Gasps, whispers, cries. Some wept openly. Others clenched their fists in silence. Someone shouted, "Down with the traitors!" And others quickly took up the cry. Traoré moved among them slowly, methodically, like a general inspecting the aftermath of a battlefield. His footsteps ground into the dust as he stopped in front of one man, a face he knew too well. A former classmate from military school. A man he had once trusted, once laughed with over plans of a free Burkina Faso. "You?" Traoré asked, his voice low, almost disbelieving. "Even you?" The soldier could not lift his head. His shame was a heavy weight pressing him into the earth. Turning back to the people, Traoré's voice sharpened. "They took money from the enemies of Africa. From foreign powers who still believe we are their property, but we are not." The silence that followed was deep and aching. Then, like a spark touching dry grass, the crowd exploded. Cheers, drums, voices raised in unison. Some cried from the raw, cutting pride of it. Others chanted Traoré's name, again and again, until it seemed the very ground was shaking with their defiance. But this public parade was not the end of the betrayal's unraveling. It was only the beginning. As investigators sifted through the seized evidence, the phones, the laptops, the radios, a darker, deeper truth began to emerge. Messages encrypted in military-grade codes, emails routed through private European security firms, documents that spoke in the cold, clinical language of covert operations. Ensure asset is removed before Q4. Priority, neutralize northern visit. Funds approved for secondary team. These were not the desperate plans of rogue soldiers. These were the fingerprints of professional intelligence networks. The money trail told its own damning story. One officer had been caught with over $50,000 in crisp US dollars and euros hidden in his belongings. Another had encrypted messages connecting him to a French-speaking operative posing as a humanitarian worker. That agent's phone number, when traced, led straight to an embassy building in a neighboring West African country. Everywhere they looked, they found Western fingerprints, diplomatic contacts, private consultants, foreign advisors offering training programs that had nothing to do with fighting terrorism and everything to do with teaching sabotage, communications control, and political destabilization. The question then was no longer, were outsiders involved? It became terrifyingly clear. The coup wasn't merely internal, it had been engineered, designed in boardrooms and embassies oceans away. But why? Why had the West moved so decisively, so ruthlessly against Captain Ibrahim Traoré? The answer lay in the bold decisions Traoré had made from the moment he seized power. He had done what few African leaders had dared. He cut the old chains. French troops were expelled. Foreign mining operations exploiting Burkina Faso's gold and lithium were shut down or nationalized. Western aid packages, always tied to hidden conditions, were rejected. No longer welcome in a country that refused to trade its dignity for loans. Instead, Traoré had turned to new allies. Pan-African movements, partners from Asia and the Middle East, nations willing to trade fairly and recognize Burkina Faso's sovereignty. He made it clear, no more colonial puppeteers, no more hidden masters. Africa would stand on its own, or not at all. This terrified the West. Because if a small, landlocked country like Burkina Faso could rise, others might follow. Mali, Niger, Guinea, even parts of East Africa. A wave of leaders, not rising with violence, but with vision, choosing sovereignty over submission. And so the whispers began. Western media, once silent, now cried out about a young dictator. International NGOs warned that democracy was at risk. Diplomatic cables urged caution. Plans were drawn in hushed tones. Sleeper cells were activated. Arms shipments flowed under the cover of humanitarian convoys. Conferences turned into recruitment grounds for young officers willing to sell their homeland for a promised future, somewhere safe and rich. Yet all their careful planning, all their bribes, all their weapons, they had underestimated one thing. They had underestimated the will of a people who had finally tasted the air of true freedom. In choosing to stand tall, Burkina Faso had not isolated itself. It had become something far more dangerous, an example, a spark in dry fields, a reminder that the old chains could be broken, that the false masters could be expelled. As Ibrahim Traoré stood beneath the scorching sun that afternoon, with the eyes of his betrayed soldiers kneeling before him and the roaring pride of his people behind him, it was clear. This was not just about one man or one coup. It was about a nation refusing to be bought. A continent beginning to remember its strength. The world was watching, but this time it would not be Africa that blinked first. The smoke had barely cleared from the streets of Wagadugu when the backlash began. Foreign newspapers printed headlines dripping with suspicion. Young dictator seizes power in Burkina Faso. A threat to democracy rising in West Africa. Western television anchors, who had remained silent during years of quiet exploitation, now found their voices, warning viewers about a military strongman undermining stability. Diplomatic cables buzzed with concern. NGOs released carefully worded statements about the deteriorating political climate. Embassies whispered warnings to their citizens, cautioning them about unrest. From Paris to Washington, a single narrative was spun. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was a danger. Not because he had betrayed his people, but because he hadn't, because he had refused to kneel. But inside Burkina Faso, the story was utterly, irreversibly different. Across the dusty markets, on cracked concrete walls, murals began to bloom. Images of Ibrahim Traoré, standing defiant, were painted beside the proud faces of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary spirit of a past generation reborn in the flesh. Children waved handmade flags in the streets. Old men who had once fought for independence wept openly, murmuring prayers of thanks. Young women sang songs of resistance, their voices carrying across the crowded streets like wild, rising winds. It was not fear that gripped Burkina Faso. It was awakening. The tension that had once choked the city had turned into something fierce and alive. Freedom, not the fragile, bought-and-sold version peddled by outsiders, but real, aching, hard-won freedom, had returned to the hearts of the people. And yet, in the days following the parade of traitors, Captain Traoré remained silent. He did not rush to stand on balconies or make speeches behind bulletproof glass. He stayed among his people, watching, listening, measuring the moment with the patience of a seasoned fighter who knew that the battle for a soul is not won in a day. It wasn't until the third evening, when the sun hung low and angry in the sky, that he finally stepped forward. There was no grand stage, no velvet ropes, no armored cars, only a wide patch of dusty earth, packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of citizens, farmers, students, shopkeepers, mothers, soldiers, waiting for their leader to speak. Traoré wore no uniform that day, no medals, just simple, worn boots coated in the dust of his homeland. Soldier of the soil, standing eye to eye with the people he had sworn to serve, not to rule. When he raised his hand, the crowd fell into a deep, aching silence. "To my people of Burkina Faso," he began, his voice carrying clear and heavy across the gathered thousands. "You have seen with your own eyes what they tried to do. You have seen how our own brothers were turned into tools by those who have always wished to own us." He paused. The silence was suffocating. "But we are not theirs," he continued, his voice sharpening like a blade. "Not anymore." A murmur, then a rumble, then a roar swelled through the crowd. They sent money, they sent weapons, they sent promises of visas, of protection, of power. But what they do not understand, what they will never understand, is this: our land is not for sale. Our blood is not for sale. Our future will never belong to outsiders again. The ground trembled with the thunder of voices rising in unison. Some chanted his name, some cried with fists raised, some dropped to their knees in tears overcome by the moment, but Traoré was not done. His voice grew deeper, stronger, not just addressing Burkina Faso, but speaking as if to the whole of Africa, every nation, every village, every heart that still beat under the shadow of old empires. "To my brothers and sisters in Mali," he said, "in Niger, in Guinea, in Congo, in Sudan, in Senegal, they will come for you too. If you stand up, they will try to break you. If you raise your head, they will try to cut it down. They will come wearing the masks of aid workers, of preachers, of investors, but their true purpose is always the same: control." He raised his hand high into the setting sun, casting a long shadow across the dusty ground. "But now we see clearly. The time of fear is over. The time of kneeling is over. This is the generation of freedom." He paused once more, then declared with thunderous clarity, "To every young African listening today, do not be afraid. Build your nations. Protect your people. And when they come with bribes, with bombs, with lies, stand firm. Stand like the baobab tree, rooted deep in your land, unshaken by the storms." The eruption that followed could not be contained. It spilled out of the square, down the alleys, across the rivers and into the countryside. It roared through the villages. It swept into the universities. It ignited something that had slumbered too long in the blood of a continent. But Traoré's vision did not end with words. He moved swiftly, decisively, to turn awakening into policy. Burkina Faso would have zero tolerance for foreign military presence. No more soldiers hidden behind training missions. No more humanitarian cargo trucks carrying guns. NGOs caught funding unrest would be immediately expelled. No more pretending. No more illusions. The nation's natural resources, gold, lithium, oil, would remain under Burkinabe control. No more foreign companies siphoning off the wealth of the people while leaving behind poverty. And perhaps most importantly of all, Traoré announced a radical new initiative. Every citizen would be given a short history booklet, a manual not just about colonialism, but about how it still lived today, in boardrooms, in banks, in whispered deals behind closed doors. A mental liberation, to walk hand in hand with the political one. Burkina Faso would be free, not only in law, but in spirit. The reaction from the West was immediate and impotent. France denied involvement. The United States issued vague statements about concern for stability. Whispers of sanctions floated in diplomatic circles, but none of it could contain what had already begun. Across the Sahel, fires of resistance were being lit. In Mali, tens of thousands rallied in support. In Niger, citizens demanded their own purge of foreign agents. In Guinea, young activists shared Traoré's speech across social media like wildfire, their captions boiling down to 3 simple words: Africa is waking, and once awake, a people do not easily go back to sleep. The dust of Wagadugu had not yet settled, and yet something irreversible had already begun. This moment, this uprising, was never just about survival. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's triumph was not merely the story of a man who escaped assassination. It was the story of a people reclaiming their destiny. The story of a continent daring to believe again. They had tried to kill him. They had planned it with careful precision, with foreign dollars, with coded orders, with promises whispered in back rooms. But they had miscalculated something far greater than any strategy or bribe. They had underestimated the force of a leader who chose not to rule from above, but to stand beside his people, to walk in their dust, to breathe their struggle, to carry their hopes on his own shoulders. On that evening, as the last colors of the day bled into the horizon, Captain Traoré stood once more before the roaring crowd. There was no armor between him and the people, no shield, no distance, only the shared heartbeat of a nation that had seen death approach and had chosen life instead. He lifted the microphone. With a steady hand, his voice thundering across the square like the first clap of a coming storm. "They tried to kill me," he said, the words cutting clean through the air, "but I survived because I walk with my people." The crowd erupted, a roar so fierce, so full of love and defiance, that the very ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Veterans raised their fists to the sky. Young boys and girls who had only ever known silence and submission screamed their joy into the heavens. For a moment, it felt as if the earth itself was shaking, not from violence, but from history waking up and demanding to be seen. This was not just a victory. It was a resurrection. That betrayal had been exposed, the foreign puppeteers had been dragged into the light, and a flame, a wild, unstoppable flame, had been lit in the hearts of not just Burkina Faso, but of Africa itself. But as the cheers echoed across the city and spilled into the hills beyond, Traoré's eyes remained hard, focused, because he knew this was only the beginning. The enemies of freedom do not disappear after one defeat. They retreat, they regroup, they wait. And somewhere beyond the celebration and the songs, new forces were already gathering. New plans were being whispered, new betrayals being plotted. Would Africa stand firm when the storm returned? Would the new dawn survive the old darkness? That was the question that hung heavy in the twilight air, and Traoré, standing at the center of it all, seemed to promise, without speaking another word, that he was ready. Ready to fight. Ready to walk with his people. Ready to protect the future they had torn back from the jaws of history. As the sun finally slipped below the horizon, casting Wagadugu into a deep, burning red, one thing was clear: Africa was awake, and it would never sleep again.